Here's a short vlog to compile my thoughts regarding Finnegans Wake. So I've listened to the audiobook version of it several times, and what I can tell is it's one of those books that, like, when you first hear it, it kind of doesn't really make any sense, and then on repeated listenings, you begin to piece pieces together. You don't get like a totality of meaning, but you get like fragments of thought and conversation that kind of just fly through your mind at some points. It's painting a clear image of this scene or this particular conversation or this particular sort of like think piece. And then other times it's sort of quite fragmented. It depends on the chapter. One thing I've found is part so Finnegans Wake is split into four parts. Part one is sort of takes you in medias res of the story, if you can really call it a story. And then part two, things get really, really complicated. It's part two's pretty different from part one, but I think that you really need to persevere to part three, because part three is by far the clearest to understand, and I believe it was written first, so the writing is before things get really complicated. It's not right to start at part three, but if you get defeated by the abruptness of part one and the weirdness of part two, just know that the third part and the sizable chunk of the novel is actually quite understandable. I mean, it's not that understandable. It is Finnegans Wake after all, but it is a lot more understandable than people really give it credit for. Like especially the porters in part three, chapter 4, and part three, chapter 3, part 3, chapter 3, and part 3, chapter 4 are like surprisingly wide awake language. Like Joyce uses surprisingly wide awake language for good parts of those. There's a lot of like onomatopoeia. So there's like a kikiriki, which is a German rooster sound, and a lot of morning sounds. And some of the characters, even though they might be dream characters, appear to be waking up or have woken up. Even though the text is still in this dreamlike state, the context is things are waking or have woken. And then what is part 4? Part 4 leads into part 1 because the novel has a circular nature to it. But yeah, I definitely found listening to it. So I've primarily listened to Finnegans Wake several times, and I've read parts, but sometimes it's like quite difficult on the eyes to actually like figure out what's happening on the page, just because the sentences change like language so often, and also like use compound words. It can like often when you're reading in your native language, you're not actually staring at each individual letter. You kind of see the whole word as a kind of sort of shape. And when Joyce breaks that up, it can be really difficult to actually figure out what the word is saying. So I recommend the audiobook version with Barry McGovern and Marcella Riordan. It's a really, really good audiobook. I don't think you should only listen to the audiobook. Like, you should read Finnegans Wake as well if you really want to get into it. But the audiobook is very accessible if you're willing to listened to it a few times, and it's about a 30-hour, just under 30-hour audiobook. There are parts that I like less, but generally the delivery is really good. And yeah, you just kind of get like a sense of like thought, both dream thought, but also wide awake thought, because there's a lot of like snippets of like everyday conversations, colloquialisms. Some of them are quite esoteric and archaic, but other ones are like surprisingly relevant. And a lot of contemporary artists and novelists have leaned in to certain parts of Finnegans Wake, so you'll hear things in it that you'll be like, wait a second, doesn't someone else use that? And it's like, yeah, it's because it's a highly influential book, and it's quite inventive, so it's like a really good source of inspiration. Yeah, so I recommend Finnegans Wake. I've actually got it right here. So yeah, this is it's an alright printing. I am planning on getting a different version, but I'm not going to buy another version copy of Finnegans Wake when I already have a perfectly serviceable version. I think when I get to the end of this and then I read through it, I'll try reading a slightly different version, maybe spot some minor differences. I don't think there are massive editorial differences between versions of Finnegans Wake in comparison to Ulysses. Ulysses has pretty major differences, so yeah, I don't really want to get into the topic of Ulysses in this video. Finnegans Wake is a good book. It is not the easiest to recommend to people, just because it takes a certain type of person to get into it. But it is something that I believe if you can somehow get into it, it is sort of for everyone. But yeah, it is definitely challenges you into thinking about things in different ways. And it's also my experience of reading / listening to Finnegans Wake reminds me a lot of learning a second language or even learning a third language, where you pick up, at first it's all quite unfamiliar, but you might hear some structures that maybe are similar to your native language. And then as you become more and more familiar with it, you're like, oh, I see, it begins to make a bit more sense, but not completely. There will be parts where you're like, I don't know what they did there, or that's a new sound. And also, it can be a lot like reading, like maybe you know a second language, but you're not confident in reading a full novel in that language. And reading Finnegans Wake can often be like reading a novel in a language that you only sort of know, where you pick up parts and you can see, oh, they're doing this, but there'll be a lot of unfamiliar words. I recommend also not trying to look up every time you come across a word that you don't understand. Sometimes it's good to follow that kind of paper trail and see where that leads, but you can get too bogged down in the specific words where you're not getting the flow of language, and having the flow, being in a flow state with Finnegans Wake is really important in my mind, rather than stopping and starting constantly. But if you're rereading passages, then you can really like delve into each individual word, and that will help for you reread through it again. It is a novel that challenges the reader to read it multiple times. So yeah, I think I rambled for a while about that, but yeah, those are some of my thoughts on Finnegans Wake. The Barry McGovern audiobook is good. Cheers.